Hello, bonjour, and welcome to Has Amnesty International Lost Its Way? A discussion about Amnesty International's February 2022 report that applies the false apartheid label. This discussion is part of CIJA's renewed The Exchange series that will bring together diverse voices on hot topics of interest to Canada's Jewish community. Make sure to check our website, cija.ca, and follow CIJA on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to stay up to date. I'm Joel Reitman, National Co-Chair of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. CIJA is the advocacy agent of Jewish federations across Canada. CIJA is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting Jewish life in Canada through advocacy. CIJA represents hundreds of thousands of Jewish Canadians affiliated with the Jewish federations across Canada. Like you, I am very concerned about Amnesty International's report. Today, we've gathered an expert panel to enable us to better understand why the report is so egregious and to give us the tools needed to engage in informed debate. To ensure your perspective is included, I invite you to pose any questions in the Q&A box of this webinar, and we'll try to answer all of them. I would like now to introduce our moderator, Shimon Koffler-Fogel, President and CEO of CIJA. Shimon?
Thank you, Joel, and thank you all for joining us today. Merci beaucoup de vous joindre à nous. You're being joined by hundreds of other members of the Jewish community coast to coast, as well as many from around the world. CIJA's presenting this event on behalf of the 12 Jewish federations across Canada, each of which represents and serves their local community with vital support and services while advocating for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Go online today, please, to learn more about the critical contributions that your local federations make that strengthen Jewish life here in Canada. With the exception of the usual outliers on the margins, Canada's Jewish community has united in condemnation of the Amnesty report, recognizing that it denies Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Simply put, it's an anti-Semitic diatribe, cloaked in the language of human rights. But even more, it seeks to position the anti-Israel libel within the framework of international law, attempting to present it as objective truth rather than the distorted argument of delegitimization that it really is. Beyond this, the report is filled with numerous factual inaccuracies, including its representation of international law and its denial of the diverse identity and agency of Arab Israelis and Palestinians. So today we've gathered an expert panel to discuss these various concerns. Yusuf Haddad, founder and CEO of Together Vouch for Each Other, an organization dedicated to bridging the gaps between Arabs and Jews in Israel. He's joined by Isabella Tabarovsky, a senior program associate of the Kennan Institute of the Wilson Center and an expert on Soviet anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in contemporary left. And finally, Anne Hertzberg, legal advisor to our good friends at NGO Monitor and an international law expert. Following their presentations, we'll also tack on some comments about the specific Canadian context and then turn to your questions and observations. Starting off our discussion is Yusuf Haddad, who'll share his lived experience as an Israeli Arab. Following Yusuf, who somehow managed to squeeze us into a schedule that was previously pre-booked, Isabella and Anne will present and remain with us for the remainder of our question and answer session. So Yusuf, turning to you, could you take a few minutes to share your experience of growing up in Israel as an Israeli Arab and discuss, frankly, whether you agree with Amnesty's assessment?
First of all, Shimon, thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be with all of you guys, and it is very important. Once I heard what is the panel about and the subject, I immediately understood how much it's important for me to give you my voice. And I know that I have only a few minutes, but in order for me to actually address the lies and the twisting the facts on that 280 pages of Amnesty, I need about an hour just to talk about the lies. And I think from here you do understand where I am going from. So apparently, after the Amnesty International report came, I woke up in the morning and realized that they are identifying me without even asking me whether I want to be identified as Palestinian. Now, I woke up as an Arab Palestinian, despite the fact that I am an Arab Israeli, holding an Israeli passport, holding an Israeli ID. Yes, I am not going to come and say that Israel is a perfect country. In fact, there's no such thing as a perfect country. Not Canada, not the US, not any country in Europe, not even those Scandinavian countries, and also Israel. It's not. This is unfortunately something that we see in our world. But between the reality and between what's going on in Israel, there's a huge, huge difference, especially from what's going on in that report. And when Amnesty categorized Israel and defined Israel as an apartheid state, I ask myself, am I missing something? Because the people who wrote this report, probably some of them never visited Israel. Probably some of them visited Israel only in the places that they wanted to visit, not even speaking like people like me. So knowing that, understanding that, I had to do something about it. And the simple thing is just to say the truth and share the facts of my life. Now, let's talk about apartheid. Apartheid, something that comes from South Africa. And we understand what that means. Every person who is a bit knowledge knows the definition of apartheid. And if you are knowledge, and if you know the definition of apartheid, then you know that you cannot compare that to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let me give you a couple of examples from my life. I, as an Arab Israeli, decided to join the IDF. I volunteered to serve in the IDF. And the IDF stands for Israeli Defense Force. It's not a JDF, it's not a Jewish Defense Force. Because when the IDF protects its civilians, it protects all of its civilians, Arabs and Jews. And when Hamas and Hezbollah launches their rockets and target Israel, their rockets, they don't discriminate between Jews and Arabs. They don't have a GPS in the rockets that they find an Arab and say, oh, let's not land here, let's go to a Jewish town. And in fact, we saw that in the last operation in Gaza, where Jews and Arabs were killed. And if you go back to Lebanon, in 2006, 44 Israeli civilians were killed by Hezbollah rockets. Half of them were Israeli Arab Muslims. So we do understand that knowing that the IDF protects also civilians, I've decided to volunteer. Now you expect from an apartheid state not to allow me to be in the army since I'm an Arab, I'm not a Jew. But not only I did serve in the army, I actually was a commander in the IDF over Jewish soldiers. I, as an Arab, was a commander over Jewish soldiers, and if they disobey my order, I can send them to prison. This is not apartheid. In what reality, on what sense of understanding, this is an apartheid. But let me go even further. Put me aside. Let's not talk about the fact that I was a COO of a marketing research company managing hundreds of Jewish employees. Okay, put that aside. I know that there is a usual stigma about the Jews, controlling, for instance, money. I know that stigma, it's been all over. But how many of you, for instance, knew that the head of the biggest bank in Israel, Bank Leumi, is Samer Hajjihya, an Arab Muslim from Taibeh? How many of you are familiar with the name Salim Jubran, a Supreme Court judge that literally sent a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister to prison? This is not apartheid. And yes, They are talking about me. They are talking about my community, the Arab Israeli community, not just those who are in the West Bank and in Gaza. And even then, it's not apartheid. And last, because I know that I'm limited on time, I will tell you two things. One, if you're asking me, okay, so this is what you say, Youssef. What about the majority of the Israeli Arabs? What about what's going on with the Israeli Arab society? In fact, a survey that was conducted just this year asked the Israeli Arabs how do you define yourself? And give them four options, either as Arabs, or as Palestinians, or as Arab Israelis, or as Israelis. More than 72% answered either as Arabs or Arab Israelis. 7% only defined themselves as Palestinians. Completely the opposite from what Amnesty report said. And the last thing is, because I do really want to talk about Gaza and the West Bank, if we go and see what's going on in Gaza, Israel doesn't control even 1 inch of Gaza. We gave it all away. The simple thing is that right now, Gaza is being controlled under the terrorist organization Hamas. And I spoke with Gazan people, Palestinians who live in Gaza, and they told me that they are being terrorized. So Hamas is not only terrorizing Israel, but also terrorizing their own people. And if you only just dig a little bit inside, if anyone from the Amnesty human right organization, would go actually to Gaza and to see exactly where the money goes, they would understand the crucial mistake that they did. By the way, I know that they have the opportunity to go to Gaza, or they were in Gaza, but they're blind and they don't want to see it. And as for the West Bank, any situation occurred today, it's because of the agreements that the Israeli side and the Palestinian side came from Oslo Accords to Hebron Accords to even any agreement that it's having today. The majority of the Palestinians are under the Palestinian Authority, military and civil control. Yes, we need to find solutions for Area B and Area C. But it doesn't mean that right now, even though that Israel controls Area C, that the Palestinians living under an apartheid regime. It's far, far away from the reality. And to sum it up, just think, what is the one thing in common between Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, BDS organization? I'll tell you. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ceased to exist and there will be peace, none of those organizations will be relevant, which means there will be no more fundings for those organizations, which means all of the people who are working in those organizations cannot earn even 1 cent. That's why it's important for them to make sure that the conflict exists and remain. And we need to make sure that the truth and the facts are up there, and we need to stand in front of them and against them. And that's exactly what we will continue to do with the Jews and the Arabs who live here in the Israeli society, united as one, obviously getting the extremists on both sides as far as possible away, and let the calm and the reasonable voice of the Israeli society and the world come up and face those liars from Amnesty organizations and BDS and all the other anti-Israelis.
Youssef, thank you. To be honest, you anticipated a whole bunch of my questions. I know that you have to run in a couple of minutes. You did suggest that there was a motivation for organizations like Amnesty International to promote these kind of reports. It's almost existential for them. Without them, they would cease to be relevant and exist. Is that the only thing that's motivating them? And on the flip side, I think you correctly acknowledged that Israel is not a perfect society. And there are tensions, there are areas of discrimination. I think that we're encouraged that both society and governments are working towards addressing them. But in addition to the motivations of the amnesties in advancing and promoting these reports, what should be the response of an Israeli government, of those of us outside of Israel who support the legitimacy of the Jewish state? Should we simply ignore it? Should we challenge it? Should we be speaking, in your view, to our governments? How do we react to this kind of libel accusation?
All right. So let me first of all start by saying one of the most important things that we need also to acknowledge, because it is happening. We also all the time refer to Israel as a Jewish state, which it is. But Israel is also a democratic state. So I really suggest strongly every time add Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. It is happening. We've seen that. We are living that. And I'm talking about the Israeli civilians. Yes, again, don't think that I am saying that there isn't problems and that we don't have racism or anti-Semitism, or that we have problems with equality. All I'm saying is that in general, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and both of those definitions can exist together. By the way, I'm a perfect example of that. Now, saying that, eventually, we need to understand that we must work in fixing those problems. And the only way we can fix those problems is together, Jews and Arabs in Israel. Now, who is standing in front of us? Extremists from both sides. You know, I've been called a terrorist by Jewish extremists. I've been called a traitor by an Arab extremist. Again, the common thing between them, that they are minorities in our society. But unfortunately, they are a violent, much louder minority, very extreme, and they're not afraid to use even to threaten me and threaten my organization, threat people, and threat the majority who wants actually to live side by side. And again, watch this. The only two groups that gain from elevating this conflict is the group of the extremists on both sides. So one of the things that the government, Israel, us, the society, that we need to do is literally unite together against those extreme voices. I'm telling you that we are working very hard on that, especially with our organization, the Arab-Israeli organization, together vouch for each other, where we try to meet with people from the Arab society in Israel and with people with the Jewish society in Israel, and try as much as possible to share a little bit more information about both of us, and then together to cooperate. So when we do that, that's why, by the way, the extremists from both sides are very afraid from our activities, because they're seeing that we are actually managing to create this disunity in the majority of those silent people and this silent society. So if there is something that I can say to you guys and to my government and to my people, is it is the time for us to stand against those extremists, and it is the time for you guys to support us in that battle, and definitely understand that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and make sure also to say that, not just Jewish, but it's a Jewish and democratic state. Be proud on the fact that Israel is also a democratic state. So these things are very important, not just by saying it, but also doing it. So I hope everybody can also join and support us with this battle against the extremists.
Yusuf, thank you. Thank you for the noble work that you do in building bridges between Jews and Arabs, Muslims and Jews, all sharing that Israeli passport. And thank you for joining us when I know you had a very, very pressed schedule. We'll take your words to heart. I suspect the only ones who don't welcome your observations are the ones who want to perpetuate the myth about the impossibility of Jews and Muslims sharing a country in peace, recognizing the legitimacy of the Jewish state and working towards peace. So God bless, and thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to seeing you in Israel very soon.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Okay, we're now going to turn the floor to Isabella. The question is, what's the genesis of the apartheid claim as it relates to Israel? And is it reasonable, is it fair for us to regard or consider the Amnesty report as anti-Semitic?
Thank you, Shimon. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm an expert on Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, and I've been focusing in recent years, in particular, on the Soviet international anti-Zionist propaganda campaign, which took place between 1967 and 1988, approximately, propaganda which was specifically geared at the Western left. And here's what I understand from my research today. Portions of contemporary anti-Israel left, to which Amnesty belongs, have been reproducing the tropes from that era with stunning accuracy. And I've written about it extensively, all of the tropes that we're so well familiar with today, that Israel is a settler colonialist, imperialist, Nazi, fascist, racist, Jewish supremacist, apartheid state, they all come from there. Another thing that's important to understand is that Soviet propaganda developed these tropes not out of concern for social justice or fairness or equality. It developed them for political purposes. It had political needs, foreign policy needs, domestic needs, and it developed these tropes as part of the Cold War propaganda war. These tropes first penetrated the Western left some 50, maybe even 60 years ago, and have remained a mainstay. And I think that the only difference between them and now is that for a very long time, they lived on the fringe, on the hard left that was not part of the mainstream. And today they're moving into the mainstream. And that is what's so concerning. And I think what's crucial to understand about these tropes is that they're meant to demonize and not to criticize. And that is a crucial difference. So when I see a report like Amnesty's report, the first thing I look at is the framing and the specific rhetoric that the report uses. So let me tell you what I see in this report from this perspective. So to me, it's absolutely clear that Amnesty's report is written in order to demonize rather than to criticize. It's obvious from the way it's written, because you can see from the beginning that it's based on the premise that Israel is an evil state, an evil entity. This presumption and these conclusions are baked into the language of the report before you even get into the substance. Number two is that, and it's connected to it, is that the report takes a conspiracist perspective of Israel. And this was actually particularly clear in an interview that Amnesty officials gave to a Times of Israel reporter. And if there is only one thing you read about this report, read that interview. In that interview, Amnesty officials talk about Israel's complexity and Israel's complex democracy essentially as being a cover-up for something nefarious and impenetrable. This is a straight out conspiracist perspective. They talk about Israel being so powerful and exercising so much control that it has prevented the international community from acting, right? Israel that's so much under scrutiny, disproportionate scrutiny compared to anybody else. Nevertheless, the international community still can't see through the curtain that Israel has pulled over itself, and it's manipulating the community from behind this curtain. So again, there is an assumption of evil built into the perspective. Number three is what I see, that the report rewrites history. In this report, you will not find any references to the fact that Israel was attacked in 1948 by several Arab states. You will not find anything about Israel proposing numerous offers to the Palestinian side. You will not find anything about the terror attacks, about the Intifada. It's just not there. It's a completely manipulated and rewritten history. And to me, who grew up in the Soviet Union, it's just shocking. I'm used to seeing history rewritten. I couldn't imagine that I would see an international human rights organization rewriting history so blatantly. And then there is the talk of Jewish supremacy and racial superiority. That is a complete detachment from reality. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just not grounded in race. That is simply wrong. And again, it's an attempt to fit the story into the contemporary narrative in order to demonize. So all of these elements and tropes and motifs were present in Soviet propaganda in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's important because it helps us understand that what we're dealing with, again, it's not a critique, it's essentially propaganda and a political hit job. The Soviet Union started using the apartheid state label already in the 60s, maybe even earlier. You see them comparing Israel to South Africa, particularly in their broadcasts. They were directed at Africa because they were trying to isolate Israel there and to create hostility toward it. And obviously the comparison to South African racism and system resonated the most there in Africa. And Soviet propaganda was obsessed with calling Israel a racist and Jewish supremacist state. And it started doing it before 67. So it's not related to 1967 at all. All of this was a lie then, and it's a lie now. And so again, I come back to the idea that we're dealing with a piece of political propaganda. And the question is, look, propaganda always has a political purpose. And so we need to understand whose purpose this report serves, right? It rejects Israel as a legitimate state. There is an idea that all Palestinian refugees should be given the right to return to Israel proper, which is obviously, it's an idea that undermines Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. It deliberately refuses, as Yosef was saying before, to distinguish between Palestinians in the occupied territories and Israeli Arabs. And that's sort of the idea there is to create a shared identity and possibly to undermine Israel from within. The proposed actions and solutions are essentially geared at dismantling Israel as it is. So again, there is a political program behind the report, and I think that we need to understand that this is what we're dealing with. Is it anti-Semitic? I would say that anytime we're dealing with the demonization of Jews, you are stepping into the anti-Semitic territory, absolutely.
Isabella, thank you. It brings back a lot of memories of especially challenging times during the Soviet regime, and many a Jew who tried to leave this former Soviet Union has the scars to give proof to the observations that you just shared. We'll turn now to Ann Hertzberg, who can perhaps unpack some of the legal dimensions that impact on this conversation. But I think, and context is always everything. So may I spend a moment just situating Amnesty's history and whether this report represents the bombshell that some have described it as, or whether really it flows from something else. And in addition, turning more to the legal stuff, from a legal perspective, what is apartheid and what are the necessary consequences to that kind of status of a nation state? And is that even the definition being used by Amnesty in this report in terms of their definition of apartheid and how it relates to Israel?
So thanks so much, Shimon, and thank you to Sija for having me. And I have a hard act to follow after you, Saif and Isabella. But turning to your questions, so Amnesty was actually founded in the 1960s by a Jew born in Jerusalem, actually. But unfortunately, and they were originally founded to campaign for prisoners of conscience, and probably many of you remember, in high school or even in university, writing letters on behalf of prisoners of conscience. However, in the past 20 years, Amnesty has had a serious anti-Israel and I would characterize it as anti-Semitic problem. So when you look at Amnesty's reporting over the past 20 years, there's extreme bias and promotion of what we know as the 3 Ds: double standards, demonization, and ultimately delegitimization of Israel. And really, it's only gotten worse. Now, these issues I'm bringing up here just briefly, really could be hours and hours, filling a lecture for a day, but we don't have that time, obviously. So I invite everyone to look at our website, where we have a lot of extensive materials on Amnesty and the reporting over the years. But I'll just highlight a couple of key things. They were a key player at the NGO Forum at the 2001 UN Durban Conference, which many of you also are probably familiar with. And at that conference, a group of over 1,000 NGOs, including Amnesty, which was one of the leaders, adopted a declaration accusing Israel of apartheid and the imposition of a program akin to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, where they called for the imposition of full diplomatic, cultural, and economic boycott and isolation of Israel, as well as the establishment of an international court in order to prosecute Israeli officials for apartheid. Now, over the years, if you review their publications, they've done things like call the fighting in Jenin to root out the terrorists in 2002 after the wave of horrific suicide bombings and the bombing at the Passover Seder. They called that an IDF massacre. They've made many false claims relating to Gaza, exemplified in the Goldstone report. And when you look on their website at the various reporting, and I actually just did this a few days ago just to sort of see where things were, because the last time I had done it had been a few years ago, there's much more reporting on Israel than almost any other country, and especially in the Middle East even. So that just highlights the double standards and the disproportionate focus on Israel. The organization has also had a lot of trouble with anti-Semitism in recent years. So several years ago, there was an official who is still employed by Amnesty UK who made many anti-Semitic statements, very crude statements about some Jewish members of British Parliament, some conspiratorial claims. He was investigated, still on staff. In 2015, at their annual conference, when they were adopting campaigns for their programs for the coming year, one of the resolutions was to campaign on the issue of anti-Semitism in England, where there had been quite a large increase in attacks on Jews, and Amnesty voted it down, and it was the only resolution voted down. So there were, I believe, 16 resolutions, 15 passed, except for the one that was going to address anti-Semitism. And they just elected a new Secretary General a few months ago, and she had made many prejudicial statements about Israel, including a claim in 2013 that Israel had murdered Yasser Arafat. And she was actually heavily criticized when she took office when that came out. They also have a lot of issues with how they approach terrorism. So in 2010, for instance, they fired, and it has nothing to do with Israel, it's just their general ideology and outlook, which I think ties into what Isabella was saying. In 2010, they fired the head of their gender unit because she was speaking out against amnesty partnerships with supporters of the Taliban. And rather than realize what they had done, the acting Secretary General of Amnesty came out and said that there's something called jihad and self-defense. So that just kind of gives you an idea. Now, was this report a bombshell? No, it was not. But so we might want to ask ourselves, why was the publishing of this report now? Why is Amnesty publishing this report now? So there's nothing new about this report. As I mentioned, this type of thing really grew in earnest amongst the NGO community 20 years ago. I'm actually shocked. They say it took them 4.5 years to write. But it's essentially the same report that was issued last year by Human Rights Watch, which in turn was essentially a very close rewriting of a report that came out in 2009 by a group of BDS activists. So there's really nothing new here. Why, though, did they put it out now? I think part of it was they didn't want to be missing out from the party. They wanted to get in on the action because HRW had gotten a lot of media attention for its report. But really what they're doing is they want to capitalize on some events that have been happening at the International Criminal Court and at the UN. So a year ago, the ICC pretrial chamber in a 2-to-1 controversial decision basically authorized the prosecutor of the court to open an investigation on the situation in Palestine, which would allow them to investigate Israelis for crimes against humanity and war crimes. So Amnesty wants to try to influence that process, and it would be their dream to have someone at the court indict an Israeli official for a crime against humanity for apartheid. That would be like their ultimate dream. They've been trying to do this for over 15 years now. And at the UN, there are actually 3 things happening this year. First up in March, the special rapporteur for the Palestinians, who has frequently and basically except in one case, is an extreme anti-Israel ideologue, is going to be publishing a report at the end of March calling Israel apartheid. And then this commission of inquiry that was set up in the wake of the May conflict, based on their terms of reference, will also call Israel apartheid. And they appointed a South African woman to head that commission deliberately for that purpose. And then there's another committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Basically in 2018, the Palestinians filed a complaint against Israel, the first time this has ever been done by any country, and basically claimed Israel was engaging in apartheid. And this committee that actually went against the Office of Legal Counsel at the UN, which is the first time this has ever happened, decided they were going to go ahead with this committee, and they are supposed to start meeting at some point in 2022. So I fully expect we're going to be seeing 3 reports out of the UN making the apartheid charge, and obviously they will be copying a lot of these NGO claims. Now, I just want to mention that the reason the apartheid charge is so powerful is because it's an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitic tropes to transform the conflict from one of disputed land and Arab rejectionism to one of Jewish racism. And as we know, racism is one of the worst accusations one can be charged with, and South African apartheid was one of the worst crimes of the 20th century. And the other powerful aspect is that it includes a plan of action, which I mentioned: boycotts, international isolation, and elimination. Now, in December 2021, UK barrister Josh Kern and I published a report going over the history of the apartheid charge and looking at the legal definition of apartheid. And surprisingly, one would think, because most of us are familiar with apartheid and apartheid South Africa, in international law, there's actually been very little written about what is apartheid, what is the definition of apartheid. So we published a report on that, and I'll add a link to it in the chat. But essentially, there are really 3 or 4 definitions of apartheid in international law, depending on how you're using it, whether you're talking about apartheid as a war crime, apartheid as a crime against humanity, or apartheid as a state prohibition. And in some of the treaties where apartheid is mentioned as being prohibited, there's no definition offered at all. And the definition in where it's deemed a war crime against humanity, it employs terms like domination or oppression, and these terms are not defined in these treaties, and they're very vague. So what does that even mean? So Amnesty and Human Rights Watch before have basically exploited this vacuum to invent a definition that would solely apply to Israel. One of the things they're doing, which is very sneaky, is in the international law, in the conventions that exist, the crime of apartheid is tied to the practices and policies that were in place in apartheid South Africa. So in order to judge what is apartheid, you need to look at those policies and practices. But what HRW and Amnesty have been doing in the case of Israel is they're trying to decouple it from South Africa. They're trying to do that in order such that they could apply it here. And as we heard from Yusef, it's absolutely absurd to make the claim here, but they're trying to do a very, it's really sneaky what they're trying to do. And most people aren't familiar with the law, and so they don't understand that. I guess I'm out of time, so I don't want to get too much in the legal weeds, but I will just, I'm happy in the Q&A, like if people have more specific questions on the various legal elements, I'm happy to get into that into more detail. So thanks.
And thanks very much. I think you're right. We could go on all day about these things, and maybe we should. So Isabel, let me direct a question to you. But before doing that, just to take care of a technical detail, many have asked whether this recorded session will be accessible. We will be posting it to our website over the coming days, so just check back with CJA.ca and you'll be able to access it. I'd also like to draw your attention to the chat box because some resources like the one that Anne just referenced in terms of the NGO Monitor report, can be accessed over there. But Isabella, turning to you for a moment, is there significance in Amnesty anchoring the report in 1948? You know, typically when we talk about conflict and Israeli occupation, the default focus is on 1967, but Amnesty actually begins its argumentation about inherent nature of Israel as being conducive to apartheid policies all the way back to its very creation in 1948. So I'm wondering if you can offer some thoughts about whether that was just rhetorical or was there a strategic rationale for it, and how do we respond to it?
Well, I think that there is definitely a strategic rationale to it, and I think it's very much in line with what we've been hearing lately from the anti-Israel left, maybe not only so, not just lately, but especially lately. And I think the idea is to undermine the very legitimacy of the existence of the state. And it comes through the entire text of the report, that this is the idea: Israel has no right to exist because it is a supremely evil state, as Anne was saying, racist, apartheid. While as soon as you define a state in those terms, it loses all legitimacy. So I think that that's 100% there. How do we deal with it? Is I think we have to look. I'm a historian, and so I think a big part of it is that we have to know the history of the rhetoric that Amnesty uses. I think that a lot of times what undermines us is that I think we in Canada, in the US, the Jewish community is very well familiar with what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany. And they're not at all familiar with what happened to Jews, for example, in the Soviet Union, which is ironic because, of course, these communities played a huge role in supporting and being part of the Soviet Jewry movement. I think that we need to know that history so that we understand this kind of the leftist tropes and how damaging they are, how they can be geared to undermine and to delegitimize. And I think that's really important. So as always, I think the answer to a lie is the truth. But in this case, I think that the community needs to learn more before it can really competently address this issue.
So, and at NGO Monitor, you track the activity and the work of countless organizations that are active in international community. Whether we're talking about Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or even UN agencies, are there other countries who would be the target of specifically the apartheid accusation? Or is this exclusively an Israeli phenomenon?
Well, so that's what's so interesting. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have called the situation in Myanmar to be apartheid. And they try to use that as kind of a fig leaf. Oh, we're not singling out Israel. We've done this for Myanmar. But when you look at Myanmar, they actually use a definition that is in keeping with the international treaties. They have not invented a definition when we're looking at Myanmar. Whereas in Israel, they have completely invented a definition that's not even, it's not found in any treaty. So there's that. Also, when you look at how are they promoting this charge? I mean, first of all, they've been doing this for Israel for a long time when it could apply. I mean, certainly in the Middle East, you can think of a lot of situations that are much more akin to an apartheid situation than what we're dealing with here. But just even how Amnesty has been promoting this report, they have a course online now. It came online the day after their report came out. It's a 2-hour take-home course about how Israel is apartheid. It's horrible. I tried to take it and was disgusted after looking at it for 2 minutes. And they don't do this in any other situation. They've supposedly been promoting the Myanmar thing since 2017. They don't have a course on Myanmar. They don't, every day on Twitter now, they've been putting these little propaganda videos. Again, they don't do that in other situations. They haven't put in the types of resources they have in our case. And also, you know, in that interview that Isabella mentioned in the Times of Israel, you know, he really exposed these double standards because he said, you know, so now that you have the supposed definition, are you applying it systematically now and looking at other countries to see if they also fit the definition? If you think apartheid is this hugely important issue, are you now starting to see where else the definition fits? And of course they said no, they couldn't come up with anything. So it just highlights what the purpose of this whole exercise has been for them, which is a political purpose to take advantage of what's going on at the ICC and the UN and to, you know, advance their ideology.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask maybe a provocative question, and it's open to either of you to try and help us with it, and then after that one, I just want to turn to the Canadian dimension for a moment. We've had a number of comments in the Q&A chat of expat South Africans, all of whom were suggesting, I've lived in South Africa, I grew up in South Africa under apartheid, Israel isn't South Africa, Israel isn't apartheid. Yet, you have not a few leading South Africans, both those alive and others like Bishop Desmond Tutu, who recently passed away, who were very, very direct in linking Israeli policies and practices to apartheid and to the kind of apartheid that they experienced in South Africa. How do we address that?
I mean, I think what you have to, first of all, I don't know the familiarity with some of these people with what is going on here. Have they even visited here? Do they know what they're talking about? Are they just repeating propaganda that they've heard? You know, I don't know. You know, Desmond Tutu he was an amazing champion of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I think he had some very troubling views about Jews that he expressed. So you can be right about some things and wrong about others. I will note there's another South African named John Dugard, who was a UN rapporteur and is really the spearhead of the anti-Israel campaigns at the UN on this issue. And I heard him at a webinar about a month ago saying he thought Israel was worse than South African apartheid. But he's very active in the BDS movement. He's been in events with people like Roger Waters, Alice Walker, who believes that, you know, Jews are the embodiment of these alien lizard people and all these like crazy anti-Semitic conspiracies. So I have to wonder, I mean, many of these people who are saying that have very troubling associations. And so, you know, they have not made convincing cases about why they think it's you know, worse than South Africa or exactly like South Africa. And I had been to South Africa. I was there a few years ago, right before COVID. And you still feel the effects of South Africa, of apartheid South Africa when you're there. And it's just beyond offensive when you think about what that regime was like to compare it to what's going on in our case.
So folks, I'm just noting the time. Perhaps we can get back to the Q&A in a moment, but I did promise that I would offer just a couple of comments about sort of the Canada specific issue. Because like our chair, Joel Reitman, I've received many inquiries wondering about the absence of any comment by the government of Canada. And it's a fair question. And in responding to it, I'd make just two important points. First, in point of fact, Canada has already weighed in. And it unequivocally has rejected the charge. Then Foreign Minister Mark Garneau rejected the accusation during the Gaza conflict 8 months ago and presented the formal position of the government in an unambiguous and unqualified way. And just as the American, nation states are reluctant to ever respond directly to non-governmental organization reports. And so, they tend to look for other ways to comment if they feel a need to comment at all. And just as the American used an official at the State Department to reiterate their rejection of the claim, Canada's ambassador to Israel, Lisa Stadelbauer, in the name of the government, rejected that odious characterization of Israel in a presentation just a couple of days ago to the Canada International Council here in Canada. So Canada is on the record in exactly the way that they would want them to be. But there's a second consideration, and frankly, we don't want to shine more light on Amnesty International and its toxic report. We knew that while we may be preoccupied with it, it had virtually no media legs because it had very little objective credibility. And in point of fact, it didn't last for more than the immediate or initial 24-hour media news cycle. And the concern, frankly, was that additional attention would only provide opportunities for Israel's detractors to add to the anti-Israel narrative. For the record, following discussions with the Israelis, they too have decided to ignore and dismiss the report. And I think that that's an important part of any consideration or strategy to deny the report any kind of objective legitimacy, because its genesis, it's not born from what I would call a kosher place. The interest is not genuinely in enhancing the quality of life of any segment of Israeli society. It's about marginalizing and delegitimizing the Jewish state that was endorsed by the United Nations back in 1947. So that's my comment on the Canadian dimension, and I'm happy to pursue that discussion with anybody online or offline. Again, mindful of the time, I'm just wondering, rather than pose a question, and I thank everybody who posted questions in the Q&A. Isabella and Anne, most of the people on this call, not everybody on this call, but most of the people on this call are committed to seeing Israel thrive, contribute to the global well-being of humanity, and to be able to advance justice for all of its citizens. In that commitment, we want to contribute. We want to make a meaningful contribution to that conversation. If I had to limit you to one thought about what we should be thinking of and what we should be sharing with others, and what would it be? And then Isabella will turn to you for your thought.
Well, I think we need to use this report as an opportunity to start re-educating young people in the diaspora, in Canada, in America, in Europe, about Zionism and the State of Israel, the moral and legal foundations upon which the State of Israel was founded, the history behind the founding of Israel, and that to me is the best way to challenge these reports, which are really a libel, and that are aimed at eliminating our country. That's the point of these reports. It's not about fixing a certain policy or improving things. It's about eliminating the country as a Jewish state. And so unfortunately, the way the education system has been going in recent years, people are not connected to that anymore. And there's a lot of, ignorance in some cases and misinformation going around. And so I really think that that's something that Jewish communities can take on and pro-Israel community to kind of turn this into a positive opportunity to really sort of reestablish the connection and knowledge of people in the diaspora, not just Jewish community, but also, the population in general.
Thank you, Anne. Isabella, last word to you before we turn it back to my boss.
I think that, first of all, I completely agree with Anne, and I want to add to this. I think that the Jewish communities, both in Canada and in the United States, need to be putting forward the voices of immigrant Jews more prominently, because I find that recent Jewish immigrants into North America understand these things much, much, much better. Russian-speaking Jews, Persian Jews, somehow something happens when you become a third and fourth generation immigrant, that you lose touch with what it really was like, right, to have been oppressed as a Jew in a different country. But especially, I would say, speaking for my community, Russian-speaking Jews, I think we in particular come from a society, and even for younger Jews who were born already in North America, they have this family history of coming from a society where these tropes were used, where their families were oppressed under the banner of anti-Zionism. And so I think finding these Russian-speaking Jews and Jews from other communities and giving them voices and making them more prominent, I think would really help educate the broader Jewish community and also communicate these issues to the non-Jewish communities.
Thank you. Thank you both. By the way, people can just Google either Anne or Isabella. They're prolific writers. You can find them in everything from institutional reports to places like Tablet Magazine. We're grateful to have you as a resource, and I thank you for your time, and we'll now turn it back to Joel to wrap it up.
Thanks so much, Shimon. Boy, we could have talked for hours, and unfortunately we do have to close. Thank you, Yosef, who's not with us right now. He had to leave. Isabella and Anne, for your expert commentary and for helping us to understand more clearly the absurdity of Amnesty's report. And to all of you from around the world for joining us today. I hope that this discussion has answered some of your questions and provided you with the tools to respond to this apartheid lie. In addition to educational programs like today, CIJA is working with elected officials to ensure the Canadian Jewish communities feel safe and secure by working to ban Holocaust denial and advocate for enhanced security programs for our communities, among many other initiatives. For more information about these other issues of concern to Jewish Canadians, be sure to visit our website at cija.ca and sign up for our newsletters. Please also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for daily insights.